Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Got another request for a sermon topic last week. I was asked to talk about why terrible things happen and why and where God can be found in them. I like to think I'm a cynical person. I try to cultivate cynicism and pessimism as virtues. And yet I was caught in naivete. I thought, how am I ever going to work that into a sermon? Where will I ever get the opportunity? And then evil made a dramatic appearance in Charleston, South Carolina. The attack on a Bible study group at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church was many things: racism, terrorism, hate, mass murder. Many facets or expressions of evil in a single event. Make no mistake, this was evil, pure and simple. The more details emerge, the more twisted this shooter appears, and the more sick I feel to my stomach, and the more I am convinced that evil is the only word that can begin to describe what happened. The shooter was unambiguously motivated by racism, which is, of course, inherently evil. But more than that, he was not a part of any hate group as far as can be determined at this point. He did not, as far as we know, he did not succumb to a charismatic leader or peer pressure or the ideology of any movement. He actively and specifically chose his path. It's not like we can blame his upbringing. He was not raised to be a white supremacist. He was a quiet suburban kid brought up in the Lutheran Church, and not a conservative Lutheran church, but the very same ELCA with which the Episcopal Church is in full communion. He is much more one of us than some bolt from out there. And he chose a group of us, of Christians, faithful women and men, upstanding and revered leaders, both in secular life and in religious life. He chose to murder them in their own church, as white supremacists have chosen to attack black people in black churches many times before, because they want to communicate that nowhere is safe, let alone sacred, for people of color. Nobody pushed this man to do what he did. He even remarked that he almost didn't go through with his plan because everyone at the Bible study group, his soon-to-be victims, were so kind to him. It is true that for all the progress we have made, America is still a deeply, pathologically racist country. We still are suffering from the cancer of evil that has been sown into the soil with the blood of conquest, the blood drawn from the lash of slavery. But the evil in our environment does not diminish the responsibility of this or any attacker. Nothing does. We might try to invoke the psychological defense of lulling ourselves into thinking and feeling that this or any terrible news is quite apart from us, that it's okay because it's someone else, somewhere else. Even those of us who do not live on the island part of Cape Ann can fall into that mentality of apartness. But just as there is only one physical universe, there is only one moral universe. Like boats on a lake, any one disturbance rocks us all. And so if we accept this truth about our environment, we may feel like our security has been violated, like we are being tossed about in a storm. We may wonder whether Jesus is with us, or whether he is asleep. And that may be progress, but it's still not quite the same as the experience for Black Americans, who did not enjoy an illusion of security in the first place. Even though evil of the magnitude of the shooting in Charleston is rare, Black Americans live daily under a burden of oppression and intimidation that white Americans rarely understand, let alone feel. A sickening and outrageous blend of persistent individual, corporate, and societal discrimination, oppression, and abuse, punctuated with unpredictable, violent attacks, often perpetrated by agents of the state. White Americans may feel like the disciples in the boat, but Black Americans are the ones who have the right to say, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" A story about Jesus calming a storm may not seem like it has much to contribute to a discussion of evil. But remember that in the minds of the people who first told and heard this story, natural disasters were understood as manifestations of evil, of the supernatural chaos that seeks to undo the will of God and destroy the order God created. Chaos that is everywhere and nowhere, ready to strike without warning like a sudden storm. The ancient mind was awed by the power of God to bring order to the universe, as the reading from Job so beautifully describes. Who shut in the sea with doors, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, "Thus far shall you come, and no farther. And here shall your proud waves be stopped." We are right to cry out to God when evil breaks down anything good in this world. But what about when God answers? When God finally spoke to Job, after dozens of chapters of Job crying out, it is not to give a polite apology or soothing comfort to Job, but a fearsome confrontation. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? And so too, when Jesus wakes up, he does rebuke the storm, and then immediately he rebukes the disciples. Why are you still afraid? Have you still no faith? Even though the disciples were not responsible for conjuring the storm, they were in it just the same. When Jesus rebuked the storm, it fell to a dead calm, not good sailing weather. And so, if that boat was going to go anywhere on that sea, it would only go if the disciples were willing to pick up their oars and row. Despite the rebuke, Jesus will give us also courage and direction. For God gave us hearts and minds and bodies and wills in order that we might use them to work together with Christ. As St. Paul wrote, summoning us to open wide our hearts. In the dead calm that has now fallen over Charleston, right now, in this very moment, Sunday worship is commencing in Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. You can bet there will be a crowd inside and out. In every age, the church has thrived under persecution and drifted in times of comfort. But in another sense, the church is one big boat, and everyone has a role to play. Confronted with an evil on the scale of racism, everyone has an opportunity to do something, to pick up an oar and row in the direction Jesus points. I have stood steadfastly against racism when it was convenient and safe for me to do so. I was brave when I had nothing to lose, when standing up wouldn't rock the boat. But other times, I have fallen short of the image of God, and through inaction, through fear, through hesitation, became complicit in the hideous prejudice of people I thought I couldn't afford to alienate. While I'm glad I have never seen or heard of any episodes of racism in this congregation, each of us can and should do more to fight the racist cancer that seems to be growing all over our society. The wind and storm answer Jesus' call, but will we? It sounds like a tall order, but it's not as if it's people of color who are morally responsible for racism. It would not be reasonable, fair, or just to lay the burden on those who have suffered. And it's not as if the intentional aggressors of racism are going to be any help. And so it falls to reasonable, conscientious white people to step up, to open wide our hearts, to let no incident of racial prejudice or aggression, great or small, go unchallenged. It falls to us to be intentional in cultivating real friendships with people of color, to listen with open hearts and minds to thinkers, leaders, and creators and friends who come from different racial backgrounds, to capitalize on opportunities to expand access to positions of power, responsibility, prestige, and trust to people of color, and to consider the implications for justice in every choice we make. That sounds like a big job, and it is, and it doesn't come with an expiration date. But Jesus will be there with us, every step, every stroke of the way. Jesus himself was a member of a persecuted minority group. He knew what it was to rely on faith and faith alone, to cry out to a God who did not appear to be doing much to relieve the constant suffering, the constant threat. But he did what God called him to do, faithfully. And we who call ourselves followers of Jesus must strive to imitate his example of constant faithfulness. And together, we see that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so, in the hope of justice, which is the hope of Christ, we live and move and have our being. Trusting the far greater power of Christ's love and forgiveness to place bars and doors on our sin and fear, and ultimately every form of evil. Jesus' words are sure, his power absolute. His is the boat, the journey, the peace, and the victory. Amen.
Amen.